Hey, welcome to the first episode of Black Girl, Black Coffee, a show where we chat about black media over a nice cup of joe. I'm your host, Elise Mitchell, and today my coffee order was homemade, specifically hazelnut coffee with way too much French vanilla creamer. It was delicious, but tomorrow I think I'm going to Dunkin'. Our topic for today is why representation is so important, especially for people who belong to minority groups. And I figured there's no better way to do that than to talk about everyone's favorite topic, which is black superheroes. Or at least it's my favorite topic. Comic books are a prime example of how people use escapism and fiction to kind of let themselves let go of the problems of the real world for a little bit and enjoy a fun comic. But there's no fun in enjoying a fun comic if the people in the world that you're escaping to don't look like you. So today we're going to talk about 3 of the most prevalent black superheroes in the market today. We're going to talk about why they are good examples of black representation, and we're going to talk about the effect that they had on the world when they were dropped. Starting off, we're going to talk first about Storm from the X-Men. Her real name is Ororo Munroe, and she made her first appearance in May of 1975. She is known for having the ability to fly and for being the leader of the X-Men. So, talking about the X-Men, one thing that's really important to note is that one of the most special things about comics is the fact that while it is a time for escapism where there is wacky adventures and fantastical creatures and heartwarming stories of friendship, there can simultaneously be a story that is meant to teach a lesson or develop an idea, and X-Men is a prime example of that because X-Men is an allegory for the 1960s and the civil rights movement. All of the superheroes that exist in the X-Men universe are considered mutants, and while mutants are considered citizens of the US, they are never truly accepted by the non-mutant citizens, and they are seen as kind of a cultural and even to an extent racial other, which has obvious parallels to the black community during the 60s. The X-Men, or an organization of mutants who are in support of solving racial tensions between mutants and non-mutants and developing a world in which they can be together, is led by Storm, who is a very clear allegory for Martin Luther King Jr. because of her pacifist ideology, especially in the face of physical and systemic violence at the hands of non-mutants. Though there are some valid critiques of Storm's character, as she is often used to portray the strong, stoic black woman trope, which is problematic in many ways, she challenges long-standing ideas about the role of black women in society who are, because of their intersection at race and gender inequality, often ignored when it comes to rights movements, making her a notable character for black representation, at least for the 70s. Going a little bit backwards here in terms of release date, but I believe forward in terms of quality representation, we're going to talk next about Black Panther. Actually similar to Storm, Black Panther grew up in an African country, though when Storm was an adult, Storm moved to the US, so most of her issues surrounding race were dealt with on a local basis, whereas most of Black Panther's issues with race come with dealing from global relations, as he struggles to quell race tensions on a civil and international basis. For the sake of time, I'm going to talk mainly about the Black Panther movie, which was released in 2018. Now, this movie was absolutely huge. It made history as one of the first mega-budget movies to have an African-American director and a predominantly black cast, and that's not just talking about superhero movies, that's talking about all blockbusters. In many ways, this movie picked up slack where most other movies that include black superheroes failed miserably. Black Panther wasn't just there to fill the diversity quota. He wasn't playing a stoic black man who never spoke and never had any emotions, unlike, as I talked about earlier, Storm sometimes fills that role. As a character, he felt very full of dimension. He had fears, he faced challenges that he had to overcome. He made mistakes constantly throughout his movie. He was not just a flat, one-dimensional character that was used to tick off a box, which is something that we often take for granted when we have an all-white cast, or at least a main character who was white. Similar to Storm and the X-Men, Black Panther doesn't exist in a vacuum. He was created to portray a message, to tell a story about Black voices and to uplift Black struggles, and the director made sure to hold on to that sentiment when he chose the villain for this movie, Killmonger. Interestingly enough, Killmonger's role as the villain of the story is not only to challenge T'Challa's ideas as the King of Wakanda, a nation that has never interacted with racial subjugation ever. Killmonger also serves as a twisted champion for the average Black American, because he is the one who understands the generational trauma, the racial prejudice, all of the systemic racism that Black Panther has never experienced, making him almost more relatable than the main character. It's understood throughout the movie that Killmonger is right in the things that he says, in the comments that he makes about the oppressive nature of the US, and the only place he went wrong was choosing to seek vengeance instead of seeking peace. The last thing I wanted to commend Black Panther on was on the palpable impact that this movie had on the US. Like I said before, it broke records for its popularity, but it's also important to mention that it's one of the only all or predominantly Black casted movies that's not centered around Black suffering and Black pain, making it accessible to all audiences. Just to show how much this movie meant to everyone that was involved, the cast, the audience, everyone who had never seen a superhero movie where the superhero looked like them, I want you to listen to this clip that Chadwick Boseman had to say before the movie came out, talking about two kids that he met that were really excited for this movie.
And throughout our filming, I was communicating with them, knowing that they were both terminal. And what they said to me is, and their parents said, they're trying to hold on till this movie comes. And knowing that will be something meaningful to them, but it's to a certain degree, it's a humbling experience, because you're like, this can't mean that much to them, but seeing how the world has taken us on, seeing how the movement, how it's taken on a life of its own, I realized that they anticipated something great, and it means a lot.
In short, Black Panther was a movie for the ages that made Black finally sensational. It was something that proved that a predominantly Black cast and a uniquely Black story is worth a blockbuster, and I think that was important to children everywhere. Continuing on with our theme of Black superhero blockbusters that were released in 2018, gosh, that was a mouthful, we're going to talk about my favorite iteration of Spider-Man, Miles Morales. Miles represents what I think will be a new age of non-white superheroes because of what he stands for in the Spider-Man comics. But before we get into what he stands for in the larger comics, I want to talk about what makes him specifically good Black representation. Starting off, Miles' story just feels closer to home. Both Black Panther and Storm found their roots in fictional African countries where they were valiant warriors for their nation, but Miles feels a little bit more relatable since he is from, Brooklyn, New York, and he's just a kid. Miles Morales is Afro-Latina with a Latina mother and a Black father, so he hits more of a broader demographic than either of the two superheroes I talked about, but one of the things that I like most about his character is the way that he effortlessly weaves around overused tropes in Black media. He is allowed to have a wide variety of interests and dimensions to his personality. He can attempt to be cool, he can be nerdy, he can be funny, he can be approachable. He excels in both the arts and his academics, and when he is shown to be a gifted student at an incredibly prestigious school, the movie doesn't try to convince us that his achievements aren't in spite of his Blackness, a dangerous trope that often shows up in Black media. Like I said with Black Panther, he is a character that is allowed to have faults, and he actually does experience pain in this movie through the loss of his uncle, but the pain isn't directly tied to his blackness, so the audience isn't forced to experience unnecessary black trauma. Okay, now it's time to talk about why Miles Morales is so important to the Spider-Man universe. But in order to do that, we have to go back to 2011 when Childish Gambino auditioned to play Spider-Man. Childish Gambino, aka Donald Glover, is a black rapper who in 2011 decided that he was going to try out for the upcoming blockbuster Amazing Spider-Man in the role of Spider-Man. When he announced that he was going to be trying out for this role, Twitter went absolutely insane, talking about how they had never seen a black Spider-Man before, what this could mean for the community, and everything that it entailed. It truly was a groundbreaking moment, as people started to speculate that we would see our first black Spider-Man in 2011. Unfortunately, Childish Gambino did not end up receiving the role. It instead went to Andrew Garfield, who made a perfectly fine Spider-Man, but the idea of a black Spider-Man, or at least a non-white Spider-Man, left such an impact on the creators at Marvel, specifically Brian Michael Bendis, that he created Miles Morales in 2011. And his reasoning for creating the first black Spider-Man that Marvel had ever seen was the idea that had famously been quoted by Stan Lee: anyone can wear the mask. And I think with that idea, the world was forever changed. The idea that any superhero can be anybody. So what's the point of it all? Why did I talk about black superheroes to talk about representation? I used superheroes to talk about representation because of simply how popular superheroes are nowadays. Pop culture is booming and almost an integral part to growing up in today's society. So the impact that black superheroes and non-white superheroes have are immense nowadays on children. For example, students at Forest Hill High School in Pennsylvania were interviewed and asked what they thought that representation meant to them and how it affected them. And multiple students cited the idea that without proper representation, students miss out on major developmental moments in their life. There's seems to be a feeling of isolation when there's a lack of representation that they said could even affect mental health. Representation is key if the end goal is widespread representation of all cultures, races, and practices. It allows for people to understand the subjectivity of their experiences versus others. It allows people to develop empathy, and it brings us one step closer to a more tolerant future. A future where it's true that anyone can wear the mask.